The summer sun painted golden streaks across the suburban street as Mr. Thompson carefully arranged his collection of BBQ seasonings and marinades on the outdoor table. His weathered hands, which had seen decades of both cooking and serving the public, moved with practiced precision. The smoke from his beloved grill danced in the afternoon light, carrying the mouth-watering aroma of perfectly seasoned ribs through the neighborhood. This wasn't just any ordinary backyard barbecue, it was a celebration. His youngest daughter had just finished her first year of medical school with flying colors, and his chest swelled with pride every time he thought about it. She'd inherited his determination, pushing through countless late-night study sessions and challenging exams, all while working part-time to help with expenses. As he adjusted the temperature on the grill, his mind wandered back to 5 years ago when they'd first moved into this peaceful suburban neighborhood. The house needed work back then, peeling paint, creaky steps, and a backyard that looked more like a jungle than a garden. But he'd seen the potential. Weekend after weekend, he'd fixed, painted, and landscaped until their home became one of the most well-kept properties on the street. His wife stepped out onto their back porch, carrying a massive bowl of her famous potato salad. "Honey," she called out, "did you remember to make the special sauce?" He patted his chest pocket with a knowing smile, where a small notebook contained the secret recipe he'd perfected over 30 years. That sauce had won 3 neighborhood cook-offs in their old town, though none of their new neighbors knew about those victories yet. The sound of cars parking and doors shutting echoed from the front of the house. Their daughter had arrived with some of her med school friends. Her laughter, bright and clear, floated over the fence as she led her classmates around to the backyard. The pride in her voice was unmistakable as she told them, "Just wait until you taste my dad's barbecue." Mr. Thompson took a moment to look around their backyard. String lights hung from the fence posts, swaying gently in the warm breeze. The patio table was set with his wife's best tablecloth, weighted down with bowls of chips, fresh vegetables, and homemade dips. The old oak tree they'd strung with fairy lights cast dancing shadows on the grass. Everything was perfect. He'd spent weeks planning this day, making sure every detail was just right. It wasn't just about the food, though he carefully selected every cut of meat and ingredient. It was about bringing people together, about celebrating hard work and dreams coming true. As a father, there was nothing better than seeing your child succeed, and as a member of this community, there was nothing more satisfying than sharing that joy with others. Little did he know that this peaceful afternoon was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would reveal truths about himself he kept quiet for years, and challenge the assumptions that had quietly divided their neighborhood. But for now, as he brushed another layer of sauce on the ribs and watched his daughter helping her mother arrange flowers on the tables, everything felt just right in his world. The chairs were set up, the drinks were chilling in coolers filled with ice, and the first batch of his famous chicken wings was almost ready to come off the grill. The excitement in the air was palpable as more cars began to pull up outside. His daughter had invited her closest friends from med school, and several neighbors had already poked their heads over the fence, drawn by the irresistible aroma wafting from his grill. What started as a simple family celebration was shaping up to be something bigger. A gathering of old friends and new, of proud parents and ambitious students, all brought together by good food and better company. At least, that was how it seemed before the day's events began to unfold in ways no one could have predicted. The cheerful atmosphere of the backyard barbecue was about to face its first challenge. Next door, Mrs. Wilson stood at her kitchen window, her lips pressed into a thin line as she watched more cars park along the street. She'd lived in this neighborhood for 20 years and prided herself on maintaining what she called proper standards. Ever since the Thompsons moved in, she'd made it her business to find fault with everything they did. Today, though, she'd decided she'd had enough. Clutching her phone like a weapon, she marched across her lawn, her designer sandals clicking against the pavement with each determined step. Her perfectly highlighted hair was swept up in an expensive clip, and her pastel polo shirt bore the logo of the neighborhood association she appointed herself to lead. The smell of barbecue grew stronger as she approached, and despite herself, her stomach growled. She pushed that thought aside, focusing instead on her practiced speech about noise ordinances and property values. Through the fence, she could see people laughing and talking, could hear the clink of ice in glasses and the sizzle of meat on the grill. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice cutting through the pleasant chatter like a knife. "I need to speak to the homeowner immediately." She stood there, tapping her foot, as Mr. Thompson walked over to the fence. His friendly smile only seemed to irritate her more. "Is there a problem?" he asked, wiping his hands on his King of the Grill apron. The genuine warmth in his voice made her hesitate for just a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Yes, there most certainly is," she replied, holding up her phone. "This gathering is clearly exceeding acceptable noise levels for our neighborhood. I've been monitoring the situation, and I'm prepared to call the authorities if necessary." Several guests turned to watch the exchange, and Mrs. Thompson set down her serving bowl, moving to stand beside her husband. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Ma'am," Mrs. Thompson said calmly, "it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Saturday. We're well within our rights to host a family gathering." She gestured to their daughter and her friends, who had stopped their conversation to watch the scene unfold. But Mrs. Wilson wasn't finished. She began recording with her phone, her voice getting louder. "This neighborhood has standards," she declared, each word dripping with barely concealed prejudice. "We can't have these kinds of gatherings disrupting the peace every weekend." Other neighbors began emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Some stood uncertainly on their porches, while others moved closer to get a better view. The wonderful aroma of barbecue still filled the air, now mixed with the uncomfortable tension of the moment. Mrs. Wilson continued her tirade, making thinly veiled comments about certain people and neighborhood character. With each word, she revealed more about herself than she did about the family she was trying to intimidate. Some of the watching neighbors exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others began to move closer to the Thompsons' yard in silent support. The daughters' med school friends huddled together, whispering and looking concerned. One of them, a young woman who'd grown up in the neighborhood herself, shook her head in disbelief. She remembered Mrs. Wilson's similar behavior when her own family had moved in years ago. Mr. Thompson stayed remarkably calm throughout the entire exchange, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression neutral but dignified. Those who knew him might have noticed the slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, the kind of smile that suggested he knew something others didn't. As Mrs. Wilson reached for her phone to make good on her threat to call the authorities, nobody could have predicted how spectacularly her plan was about to backfire. The next few moments would reveal a truth that would leave the entire neighborhood speechless and change the dynamics of their community forever. The confrontation had drawn quite a crowd by now. Mrs. Wilson stood with her phone held high, recording everything while she made her call to the police. Her voice carried across the yard as she complained about disturbances and unauthorized gatherings, making it sound like a riot instead of a family barbecue. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, her patience wearing thin but her voice remaining steady. "We've lived here for 5 years," she said, looking Mrs. Wilson straight in the eye. "We've never caused any trouble. This is a celebration for our daughter's achievement in medical school. Why don't you put down your phone and join us instead?" The invitation seemed to throw Mrs. Wilson off balance for a moment. She hadn't expected kindness in response to her hostility. But she quickly recovered, her face hardening again. "I most certainly will not, and I've already called the authorities. They'll sort this out." The med school friends had gathered closer to the daughter, who stood tall despite the tears threatening to spill from her eyes. This was supposed to be her special day, a celebration of her hard work and determination. Now it was turning into something ugly and painful. One of the neighbors, an elderly man who'd lived on the street for over 40 years, shuffled forward. "Now see here," he began, his voice shaking with emotion. "I've watched that family fix up their house, help during the big storm last winter, and bring cookies to everyone during the holidays. They're good people, and you're making a fool of yourself." Mrs. Wilson's face flushed red, but she stood her ground. "The police are on their way," she announced triumphantly, as if this would somehow prove her right. "We'll see what they have to say about all this." In the distance, sirens could be heard approaching. Mr. Thompson's calm demeanor never wavered. He turned to his guests and said softly, "Please, everyone continue enjoying yourselves. This will all be sorted out shortly." Then he walked over to his grill and, as if nothing unusual was happening, began carefully turning the ribs. 2 police cars pulled up out front, their lights flashing. Mrs. Wilson's face lit up with satisfaction as she hurried to meet them. The crowd parted as 3 officers made their way through to the backyard. But what happened next would leave Mrs. Wilson wishing she'd never made that call. The lead officer, a tall man with gray at his temples, stopped in his tracks as soon as he entered the backyard. His serious expression melted into a broad smile. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice filled with surprise and warmth, "if it isn't the chief himself." Mrs. Wilson's triumphant expression froze on her face. "Chief?" she repeated weakly, her phone lowering slightly. The officer was already striding across the lawn, hand extended. "Chief Thompson, I didn't know you'd moved to this neighborhood. Haven't seen you since your retirement ceremony last year." Now it was the neighbor's turn to look surprised. They watched as Mr. Thompson set down his grilling tongs and walked over to shake hands with the officer. The 2 men embraced like old friends, which, as everyone was about to learn, they actually were. The daughter couldn't help but smile, despite the tears still shining in her eyes. She'd watched her father deal with situations like this throughout his career, always with dignity, always with compassion, even when faced with prejudice and hatred. He taught her that the best way to fight ignorance was not with anger, but with grace and truth. The revelation was about to unfold, and with it, a lesson about assumptions and prejudice that would change their neighborhood forever. As Mrs. Wilson stood there, her phone now hanging limply at her side, she began to realize just how terribly wrong she'd been about everything and everyone. The backyard fell silent as the police officer enthusiastically shook Mr. Thompson's hand. Everyone watched, fascinated, as years of history unfolded before them. "Folks," the officer announced, turning to address the gathered crowd, "you probably don't know this, but you've got a living legend in your neighborhood. This man right here was one of the most respected police chiefs in our state's history." Mrs. Wilson's phone slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the patio stones. Her face had gone from red to pale in seconds. The other neighbors leaned in closer, eager to hear more. 30 years on the force, the officer continued proudly. Started as a beat cop and worked his way up to chief. Transformed our whole department's approach to community policing. We still use his programs as models today. The second officer, a younger woman, stepped forward with a bright smile. "Sir, I went through the academy when you were chief. Your speeches at our graduation inspired half my class to focus on community outreach." Mr. Thompson rubbed the back of his neck, looking slightly embarrassed by all the attention. His wife squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with pride. Their daughter watched from nearby, remembering all the times she'd seen this same scene play out. Her humble father, never one to brag about his achievements, being praised by those whose lives he touched. "I don't understand," Mrs. Wilson stammered, finally finding her voice. "Why didn't you ever say anything? All these years." Mr. Thompson picked up his grilling tongs again, checking on the ribs before answering. "I wanted to be known as a good neighbor first," he said quietly. "Not for my title or my past job, just as someone who cares about his community and tries to make it better one small act at a time." The elderly neighbor who had spoken up earlier suddenly snapped his fingers. "Wait a minute. Last winter, during the big storm, you were the one who organized the emergency response when the power went out. Got everyone with generators to help those without. Set up that warming station in your garage. I knew that felt like a professional operation." More neighbors began chiming in, sharing stories they'd never connected before. The time he'd quietly helped start a neighborhood watch program. The safety workshops he'd suggested for the community center. The way he always seemed to know exactly what to do in any crisis. The police officers were smiling, clearly not surprised by any of these stories. "That's the chief we know," the senior officer said warmly. "Always serving, whether he's wearing the badge or not." Mrs. Wilson stood frozen, her carefully constructed worldview crumbling around her. The man she'd been trying to paint as a troublemaker was actually someone who'd spent his entire career protecting and serving communities just like this one. And instead of using his reputation to defend himself, he'd chosen to let his actions as a neighbor speak for themselves. The young officer looked at her notepad, then at Mrs. Wilson. "Ma'am, we were called about a noise complaint." She glanced at her watch. "At 2:30 in the afternoon? On a Saturday?" Her tone made it clear how ridiculous the complaint sounded. The smell of barbecue continued to waft through the air, made even more appetizing by the afternoon sun. Someone's stomach growled audibly in the quiet moment that followed. The absurdity of the situation began to sink in, and a few chuckles rippled through the crowd. Mr. Thompson looked at the spread of food on his tables, then at all the people gathered in his yard. His eyes lingered for a moment on Mrs. Wilson, who looked like she wanted nothing more than to disappear into the ground. Instead of anger or triumph, his face showed only compassion, the same expression he'd worn countless times during his career when helping people learn from their mistakes. The confrontation was about to transform into something entirely unexpected, something that would teach everyone present a lesson about judging others and the power of responding to hatred with kindness. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the backyard as Mr. Thompson cleared his throat. Everyone waited, wondering what he would say to the neighbor who had tried so hard to ruin his family's celebration. Instead of harsh words, he simply smiled and did something unexpected. "Officers," he said warmly, "would you like to stay for some barbecue? These ribs are just about perfect." Then he turned to Mrs. Wilson, who was still standing awkwardly by the fence. "That invitation extends to you too. There's plenty of food for everyone." The senior officer's face lit up. "Chief, if your barbecue is still as legendary as it was at the department picnics, I'm definitely staying." His partner nodded enthusiastically, already eyeing the mouth-watering spread on the tables. The tension in the air began to dissolve as people processed what was happening. Here was a man who, instead of taking revenge or gloating over his accuser's embarrassment, was offering friendship. The neighbors watched as years of law enforcement experience transformed into a simple lesson about healing community divides. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward with a paper plate. "The potato salad is my grandmother's recipe," she said, holding it out to Mrs. Wilson. "And my daughter made her famous chocolate brownies for dessert." Her voice was gentle, free from spite or sarcasm. Mrs. Wilson's hands trembled as she took the plate. I don't understand," she whispered. "After how I behaved, after what I said." Tears welled up in her eyes as the weight of her actions finally hit her. The daughter walked over, her medical school friends following close behind. "Dad always says that the best way to change someone's mind isn't through confrontation," she explained. "It's through conversation. And what better place for conversation than around a table full of good food?" Slowly, cautiously, Mrs. Wilson took a step forward, then another. The other neighbors began moving too, forming a line at the food table. The officers joined in, sharing stories about their favorite memories of working with the chief. The younger officer told everyone about the mentoring program he'd started, which had helped dozens of at-risk teens find their way into public service careers. "Remember that huge snowstorm last December?" One neighbor called out. "When Mr. Thompson helped push my car out of the drift, I had no idea I was being rescued by the former police chief." Another neighbor chimed in. "Or when he taught all our kids about bicycle safety at the block party? He made it so fun that they didn't even realize they were learning." As people filled their plates and found places to sit, the gathering began to feel less like two sides of a conflict and more like a true community coming together. Even Mrs. Wilson, still quiet and embarrassed, found herself drawn into a conversation with some of the medical students about their studies. The officers had to leave eventually, duty called, but not before loading up paper plates with food to go. "Just like old times, Chief," the senior officer said with a grin. "You always knew how to bring people together." As the afternoon mellowed into early evening, the fairy lights in the old oak tree began to twinkle. The story of the retired police chief spread quickly through the gathering, but it wasn't told with triumph or vindication. Instead, it became a story about judging too quickly, about the assumptions we make about our neighbors, and about the power of responding to prejudice with understanding. Mrs. Wilson sat at a corner table, watching it all unfold. She'd come to cause trouble, but found herself in the middle of a lesson about community, forgiveness, and the kind of leadership that changes hearts rather than enforces rules. The plate in front of her was empty. Turns out the rumors about Mr. Thompson's barbecue skills were true. As the evening settled in, the backyard had transformed into something magical. Paper lanterns glowed softly, casting warm light over groups of people who had started the day as strangers, but were now sharing stories like old friends. The sound of genuine laughter floated through the air, mixed with the gentle clinking of plates and glasses. Mrs. Wilson, who had been quietly observing from her corner, finally gathered her courage and approached Mr. Thompson at his grill. Her hands were clasped tightly together, and her voice shook slightly as she spoke. "I need to apologize," she said softly. I've been terrible to your family. Not just today, but ever since you moved in." Mr. Thompson continued tending to his grill, giving her the space to continue. His calm presence seemed to encourage her to keep speaking. "I watched you fix up your house, plant those beautiful flowers, help neighbors during storms, and instead of seeing good neighbors, I only saw what I wanted to see." She wiped a tear from her cheek. "Finding out you were a police chief, it made me realize how wrong I've been. About everything." He turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said gently, "my job title isn't what makes me a good neighbor. It's the same things you just mentioned, fixing up the house, planting flowers, helping others. Those are the things that really matter in a community." Nearby, their daughter was showing some neighbors her medical textbooks, explaining her dream of becoming a doctor who would work in underserved communities, a dream inspired by watching her father serve others all his life. Her mother beamed with pride as she refilled bowls of chips and brought out more ice for the drinks. The elderly neighbor who had defended the family earlier walked over with his wife. "You know what?" he said to Mrs. Wilson. "We all make mistakes in judging others. The real test is what we do after we realize we were wrong." More neighbors joined the conversation, sharing their own stories of times they'd misjudged others or been misjudged themselves. One woman talked about moving to America and feeling like an outsider until someone took the time to really know her. Another shared how his views had changed after his son made friends with kids from different backgrounds at school. The medical students listened intently, taking in a different kind of lesson than what they learned in their textbooks. One of them whispered to her friend, "This is the kind of healing that doesn't require any medicine." As the evening cooled, Mr. Thompson fired up the grill one last time to make s'mores for everyone. The simple act of sharing marshmallows and chocolate brought out childlike joy in even the most serious adults. Mrs. Wilson found herself laughing as she tried to keep her marshmallow from catching fire, coached by the very neighbors she'd once viewed with suspicion. Someone had brought out a guitar, and soft music filled the air. The daughter sat next to her father, leaning her head on his shoulder just like she used to do when she was little. "Dad," she said quietly, "I think your barbecue changed more than just people's dinner plans today." He smiled, watching as Mrs. Wilson helped a child perfectly toast a marshmallow, cheering when they succeeded. The woman who had started the day recording angry videos on her phone was now fully part of the gathering, her earlier prejudices melting away like chocolate on a warm graham cracker. The lesson was clear to everyone present. True community isn't built on assumptions or fear, but on the simple acts of kindness that break down walls between neighbors. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the gathering had become more than just a celebration of one student's success. It had become a moment of transformation for an entire neighborhood. The next few weeks brought remarkable changes to the neighborhood. It started small, a wave here, a smile there. But soon, the ripple effect of that memorable barbecue evening began to show in bigger ways. The invisible barriers that had once divided neighbors slowly crumbled, replaced by genuine connections. Mrs. Wilson surprised everyone by showing up at the Thompsons' door one morning with a homemade apple pie. Her hands still trembled slightly as she held it out, but her smile was genuine. "I've been baking all weekend," she admitted, "trying to get it just right. I thought, well, after all that wonderful food you shared, I wanted to share something too." The transformation in Mrs. Wilson became the talk of the neighborhood, but not in a mocking way. Instead, people saw it as proof that change was possible, that it's never too late to open your heart and mind. She started attending community meetings, not to complain about property values, but to suggest ways to make the neighborhood more welcoming for everyone. One Saturday morning, several weeks after the barbecue, Mr. Thompson stepped out to get his newspaper and found a group of neighbors organizing a community cleanup day. They'd been inspired by his quiet example of neighborhood service. Even more surprising was seeing Mrs. Wilson there, wearing old jeans and work gloves, ready to help plant flowers in the community garden. The daughter, home for a weekend visit from medical school, watched from the porch as her father joined the group. "Mom," she said, "remember how worried we were about moving here? Look at it now." They watched as people who had barely spoken to each other before worked side by side, sharing tools and gardening tips. The elderly neighbor who had stood up for the Thompsons started a weekly coffee morning in his garage. Got the idea from those police community meetings you used to run, he told Mr. Thompson with a wink. These casual gatherings became a place where neighbors could discuss everything from local issues to favorite recipes. Children who had once been told to stay in their own yards now played together on the sidewalks while parents chatted nearby. The sound of kids laughing and riding bikes replaced the tense silence that had previously filled the street. One little girl proudly showed off her bicycle helmet, explaining how Mr. Thompson had taught her the proper way to wear it. The medical students who had witnessed the barbecue incident spread the story at their school. It became a lesson in their ethics class about looking beyond prejudices and the healing power of community. Some of them started a program to bring free health screenings to neighborhoods that needed them, inspired by what they'd seen that day. Mrs. Wilson's transformation was perhaps the most profound. She channeled her organizational skills, once used to enforce rigid rules, into planning neighborhood events that brought people together. Her first project was a multicultural food festival, where neighbors could share dishes from their family traditions. "You know what I've learned?" she said one day, helping Mrs. Thompson set up for a neighborhood meeting. "All those things I was afraid would hurt our property values, different people, different customs, different ways of living, they're actually what make this neighborhood special. They're what give it value you can't measure in dollars." The daughter's medical school friends continued to visit on weekends, drawn not just by Mr. Thompson's famous barbecue, though that was certainly a bonus, but by the warm sense of community they felt there. They saw how a neighborhood could be more than just houses on a street. It could be a place where people looked out for each other, learned from each other, and grew together. As summer faded into fall, the change in the neighborhood was obvious to anyone who remembered how it used to be. Gardens flourished, porches filled with friendly faces, and the street hummed with the energy of a community that had found its heart. As autumn painted the neighborhood trees in brilliant colors, the story of the barbecue incident had become something of a local legend. New residents would hear different versions of it during welcome parties, but the message was always the same. This was a place where prejudice had been transformed into understanding through one family's grace under pressure. The daughter came home for a weekend visit and couldn't believe her eyes. The woman who had once called the police on their family barbecue was now helping her mother organize a neighborhood food drive. Mrs. Wilson and Mrs. Thompson had become an unlikely but effective team, combining their different skills to benefit the community. "You should have seen her yesterday," Mrs. Thompson told her daughter with a warm smile. She spent hours making phone calls to local businesses, getting donations for the homeless shelter. Who would have thought? One crisp Saturday morning, a moving truck appeared on the street. A young couple was moving in 3 houses down, and you could see the nervousness on their faces as they looked around the neighborhood. Within minutes, a small crowd of neighbors appeared, carrying welcoming gifts and offering help with boxes. Mrs. Wilson was among the first to greet them, bringing her signature apple pie. The young couple looked surprised when others told them about how she changed. "That's ancient history," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "What matters is you're here now, and this is your home too." Mr. Thompson watched from his porch, sipping his morning coffee. His wife joined him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "You know," she said, "when you were police chief, you changed lives one case at a time. But what happened here, with this neighborhood? It's like watching dominoes of kindness fall one after another." The impact spread beyond their street. Other neighborhoods started asking how they could build the same kind of community spirit. The local newspaper ran a story about their transformation, focusing not on the conflict, but on how they'd moved past it. The reporter was amazed to find Mrs. Wilson and the Thompsons laughing together during the interview. The daughter's medical school friends still visited regularly, but now they came not just to see her, but to be part of what the neighborhood had become. They joined the weekend basketball games in the community park or help out at the monthly neighborhood cleanup days. One of them mentioned during a visit, "You know, we're learning all about healing in medical school, but this neighborhood taught us about a different kind of healing. The kind that happens when people choose understanding over fear." The elderly neighbor who had first defended the Thompsons now ran a successful mentoring program, pairing older residents with neighborhood kids. "Got the idea from watching our retired chief here," he'd say with a proud grin. "Sometimes the best way to break down walls is to build bridges instead." Even the local police department took notice. They started using the neighborhood as an example in their community policing training, showing how understanding and compassion could transform tensions into connections. Officers who had been at the barbecue that day would share the story with new recruits. The front yards that had once been empty were now full of life. Children played while parents chatted, elderly neighbors rested on porch swings, and teenagers helped with community projects. The street had become what it was always meant to be, not just a place where people lived, but a place where they belonged. Mrs. Wilson, walking home one evening, stopped to chat with the Thompsons. "You know what's funny?" she said, looking around at the vibrant neighborhood life. "I used to worry about protecting our community. I never realized that the best protection comes from bringing people together, not keeping them apart." 1 year after the famous barbecue incident, the neighborhood gathered again in the Thompsons' backyard. This time, it was a planned celebration, marking both their daughter's medical school graduation and the remarkable changes in their community. The old oak tree was once again strung with fairy lights, and the smell of Mr. Thompson's legendary barbecue filled the air. Mrs. Wilson stood by the grill, now wearing her own assistant grill master apron, a Christmas gift from the Thompsons. She had learned all the secret recipes over the past year, though she still claimed her marinades needed work. More importantly, she had learned lessons about judgment, acceptance, and the true meaning of community. "Would you believe," she said to a group of new neighbors, "that I once called the police on this very gathering?" She shook her head at the memory. "Now look at us. I'm helping cook for a party that's twice as big as that one." The daughter, now Dr. Thompson, watched the scene with tears in her eyes. Her medical school friends had come to celebrate, bringing with them stories about how they'd used the lessons learned from this neighborhood in their own practices. "Remember that day?" one of them said. "We came for a barbecue and witnessed a masterclass in healing community divisions instead." Mr. Thompson, still manning his trusty grill, looked out over the gathering. Children played tag between the adults' legs, their laughter mixing with the music and conversation. Young couples who had recently moved in chatted with elderly neighbors who had lived there for decades. The barrier of us and them had completely disappeared. The elderly neighbor who had first spoken up in their defense now led tours for visitors, proudly showing off their community garden, the new playground they'd built together, and the weekly programs they'd started. "And it all began," he'd said with a twinkle in his eye, "with one very interesting barbecue." As the sun began to set, Mr. Thompson called everyone together for a toast. He rarely made speeches these days, preferring to let his actions speak for him. But tonight was special. He looked around at the faces gathered there, faces that now represented family, not just neighbors. "A year ago," he began, his voice warm and steady, "this backyard was the site of a confrontation that could have divided us further. Instead, it became the place where we learned to see each other as people, not stereotypes. My years as police chief taught me many things, but this neighborhood taught me even more, that the strongest communities are built not on fear and suspicion, but on understanding and acceptance." Mrs. Thompson squeezed his hand as their daughter stepped forward. "In medical school," she said, "we learned about healing bodies. But here, in this neighborhood, I witnessed the healing of hearts and minds. That's a kind of medicine they don't teach in any classroom." Mrs. Wilson wiped tears from her eyes as she added, "And some of us learned that it's never too late to change, to grow, to become better people. Sometimes the best lessons come from our biggest mistakes." As night fell and the fairy lights twinkled overhead, the gathering had become more than just a graduation celebration. It was a testament to the power of forgiveness, the strength of community, and the simple truth that understanding can bridge any divide. Children roasted marshmallows while their parents shared stories, elderly neighbors taught young ones old songs, and the barriers of age, background, and prejudice melted away like sugar in sweet tea. The neighborhood had become what every community should be, a place where differences were celebrated, not feared, where mistakes could lead to growth, and where one simple act of kindness could start a chain reaction of positive change that would last for generations to come.